member just identified themselves and then asked you a question to respond to.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good.
I will start with one of our members, Mike Langnet, was not able to join us this evening. And his question was just basically, why do you think you'd like to join us at Gill-Montague?
Well, several years ago, 7 years ago, I had applied for the position, gone through the initial round of interviews, and had been a finalist. And at the time, I was coming off of what I felt like was a very positive experience at Athol High School, and felt like I had achieved some things there in that district that helped me to really gain confidence in the fact that I could be of service to the district. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought to myself, I think this sounds like somebody who just really wants to be a superintendent and isn't necessarily interested in being of service. And at the time, my wife and I consulted, and I let her know that I didn't quite have as much confidence as I should, and that I wasn't quite ready to leave the principal's position. And I accepted a position at Hopkins in the midst of that process to be their principal, and have served there ever since. Over the course of that time, I've had the great luxury of working with Dr. Annie McKenzie as my superintendent for the last 6 years, somebody who I think will be a future commissioner of education. We've done a significant amount of work on issues of equity in our school district, in a largely heterogeneous school district. And going through those processes and having built a faculty and a culture where we're highly collaborative now, that I feel like I now have the skills to be of service in this school district. I live here in town, and so while that's a convenience, certainly for me, my children are also out of school. And so while I have a vested interest in the success of all of the students in the district, I no longer have the ethical considerations that I would have had back then 7 years ago. And so now I feel like I'm ready for the superintendency, and I have a degree of familiarity, not only with the district, but some of the great folks that you've hired, including Joanne Blyer, with whom I worked at Mohawk Trail, who's done a great job really of building a great deal of credibility for the budget development process, and being able to allow us as educators to be able to attach that back to really what is a resource allocation strategy, and having a much better sense of how all of those things fit together really allows me to be able to say with confidence that I feel like I can be of great service to the students in this school district.
Thank you. Jen?
Okay, the next question is to tell us about your experience working with children and families who don't look like you, speak the language you do, or have the economic advantages that you do. How have these experiences shaped your view of public education and its mission?
I think if I were to start out in Athol, 70% of those students lived below the poverty line. And one of the things that was really important to me was to recognize the fact that despite the fact that I also grew up below the poverty line, I did have both of my parents in my home, and I was given huge advantages as a result of the fact that I did really well in school. And I was given the opportunity to do really rigorous coursework that prepared me well for post-secondary study, and ultimately helped me later on in my life. I was extended in enormous numbers of leadership opportunities through the years in my schooling. And so I have this relationship to my childhood that was, despite the fact that it was very happy, I also recognized that 3 of my 4 siblings, who one of whom was younger, 2 of whom were older, were not provided anything even remotely close to those opportunities simply because of their test scores. And 2 or 3 of them definitely would have taken advantage of it. And 2 of them definitely would have stayed in school if they were treated as though they were like every other student in the school, instead of being stratified based on their test scores. So that was one thing that influenced me a great deal. I feel like I brought that to Athol, where in the first year that I was there, managing to increase enrollment in advanced placement courses by 258% in the first year, and then subsequently finishing after 3 years there as the high school principal, getting the graduation rate from 60% up to 81%. In Hadley, I had these experiences of students really, and it came from student leadership as much as anything else, that, you know, I'm white and I'm a male and I don't have any knowledge of what it's like to be non-white and to exist in those communities where you walk into a place that's largely different than you are, and, you know, have an understanding of how one's voice can be suppressed just by virtue of the fact that you're not part of the majority. So in my second year, some students came forward and wanted to start a diversity club. And so I cultivated support for that. We got that going in the school, and they continually have helped us with programming with students and education. Then we had a shocking set of circumstances where we dealt with a student who had published a video online making all sorts of inappropriate and profane references toward non-white folks. It really was hate speech, and having to deal with the fallout of that and in our school community while trying to stay unified. And I think once again, we were able to cultivate not only student but community leadership to bring our students together and continue to work on our programming, not only with our students, but with our staff. We invited in the University of Massachusetts School of Social Justice to do 2 different types of trainings for our staff, and then use that to build integrative programming with students where we engaged in active dialogue about what it meant to be different. And we sought to cultivate a strong sense of empathy among our student population, and our superintendent worked to communicate actively with the school community to help that stretch out into the school community. And as a result of that, I feel like we've become a more empathetic and welcoming school community. And I will say that that work is never done. In particular because anytime a student hears something that's disparaging, racial, sexist, whatever the case might be, I love the phrase that once is too much, that it really should never be heard, and the impact that it has on a student or a child or a member of a family of a student or a child in our schools is incredibly important, and something that's had a deep impact on me over the last 6 years. Jennifer, I'm not sure if that helps to be able to answer your question. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I think, Jane, are you trying to talk? You're muted to have the.
You're muted.
Bill, I think Bill's up.
No, we didn't hear Jane earlier.
Okay, sorry. I hit it wrong. Thank you. Bill?
Hello, Brian.
Hi, Bill.
My question is, what specifically are the 21st century skills that American educators have been talking about for these past 20 years? And how do schools help students acquire these skills?
I think the most important skills are related to collaboration. And I think that, you know, part of my answer to the previous question has to do with the training that I also received in dealing with issues of cultural differences and helping to bridge those gaps. I think the most important skill that students need to learn is the skill of collaboration in an environment where I observed my nephew, who graduated from Villanova with a degree in mechanical engineering, get interviewed by a company that took him down with 15 other kids, put them in 5 teams of 3, gave them a problem, put them up in a hotel for 3 days, and asked them to solve that problem, and then subsequently made a decision about 2 of the candidates. And he was able to tell me that he wasn't even the best engineer there. There were other kids, you know, recent college graduates who were very skilled engineers, but they took him based on the fact that he was the strongest collaborator, cultivating in students a sense of knowing when to take the lead, knowing how to take the lead, knowing when to recognize in your peers that one or the other of them presents a strength and cultivate that. to be able to make a contribution to the team, I think is one of the most important 21st century skills. And so everything that branches off of that, one's ability to collaborate, having a sense of empathy, having patience, being able to listen, knowing when to speak, being able to speak, being willing to take the lead, I think is one of the most important of the 21st century skills. Being willing to adapt, being able to adapt, and understanding that one's career that a student starts out in when they get on later in life may evolve, that children need to be lifelong learners. And in cultivating in them those kinds of mental structures is a very different approach to education than we've had for decades. And I know it's been out there for quite some time in terms of the research, but in many cases, you know, going through a class from day to day where say at the secondary level, you're in a routine where students are going to review their homework from the night before, go over those problems, get answers to those problems or questions, and then subsequently learn new material through a lecture, and then engage in problem solving as a day-to-day means of being able to implement learning for students. Certainly gives them exposure to the curriculum, but isn't the best way to cultivate other skills that students need to learn. And it's really important that teachers have a sense that we're competing for the attention of students with so many things out there in society. We have to find a way to engage them in things that they both need to learn by attaching those to things that they want to be able to learn, so that we can hear their voices, so that their voices can be shared with one another, and so that they can learn those leadership skills that are so important to be able to function in society, not just to be able to get or hold a job, but also to be able to function as citizens and make contributions to our communities.
So can I follow up? This is more a statement for a yes or no. You're saying that the 21st century skills really continue to be human skills rather than mechanical ones or electronic ones, as the case may be. Is that fair to say? You talked about collaboration, listening, and adapting. Those are your three primary skills. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Cassie?
Can you please describe your experience with curriculum development, curriculum coaching, or working with curriculum coaches and implementing any new curriculum in a district?
Yeah, so when I was the principal at Mohawk Trail, I recognized we didn't have, we had been in business since 1967, and we were sending kids from 6 different schools, not including school choice, and we didn't have a curriculum articulation plan. Our curriculum was not in fact written. So at the time, in my first year, I think there were approximately 780 students in the school, 7 through 12, and it's really difficult to ensure that every student is having really an equitable experience and a rigorous experience if you don't know what they're experiencing from classroom to classroom. So my first experience in dealing with issues of curriculum was I had been trained in understanding by design. We adopted a format where we were going to be putting things in unit plans, and the superintendent gave me the opportunity to become the district's curriculum director. And I had the opportunity to go out and train each of the elementary school faculties, as well as my own faculty, in how to use understanding by design to develop curriculum. So centering it around the idea of students engaged in meaningful learning, but also documenting everything from activities to accommodations to assessments to scaffolds for instruction to materials, and being able to provide the time for those folks. So in particular at the elementary level, on the administrative team, after I had done the training, we sat together and we put together what was a 5-year plan, and that allowed for high school and middle school teachers who are largely focusing on 1, 2, maybe 3 courses worth of content in developing curriculum, to develop those unit plans for an entire school year. Most of them were going to be able to do that given the allotted time within 1 year and a little bit of time over the summer. In addition to that, at the elementary level, they were not going to be able to do that time frame. So we focused on first what was coming from the Department of Education. At that time, it was the social studies curriculum that had changed. So what we began to do was we did a vertical process of aligning our social studies curriculum first, math came next, English came third, science came fourth, and then we did all of the electives thereafter. And that process and the influence of the elementary principals allowed that district to take, in particular for elementary teachers who are teaching multiple content areas, to develop curriculum in one content area at a time per year. And I left the district to become the principal at Mohawk before they completed that process. So that was the first experience that I had. It was much easier to do when I was a 9 through 12 principal in Athol. During the time that I was there, we used the same process and had developed that curriculum by the time we received an accreditation team before I had left the district. And that was all in the Understanding by Design format. I think of all of the courses, there were 3 elective courses that did not at that time have curriculum developed for them, and 2 of them were physical education courses that were non-health related. All of the health curriculum was done. So if you provide people with the time, the resources, the training, and the opportunity, teachers will collaborate to get that work done if they're given that training and that opportunity. And then from there, you create a structure, from my perspective, to ensure that you're able to allow that curriculum to evolve as you have outside influences over time. It may come from the Department of Education. Most recently in Hadley, we had redone our vertical structure in a similar format in science after the National Science Standards had an influence on the Massachusetts frameworks, and subsequently just completed the process of doing that in social studies. We're in the process of doing that in mathematics this year.
Thank you. Haley?
Hi, Brian.
Hi, Haley.
So I'd like you to share with us the evolution of your understanding of the importance of social emotional skills and affective learning in students, how and why these skills are important. How have you supported this type of learning amongst your students and faculty? And what measures would you take to support social emotional learning in Gill-Montague?
So I think one of the things that was really important for me was the experience that I had in Athol. We carried something, and we contracted with Quabbin Mediation, who engaged a group of identified student leaders in being trained as active bystanders. And so the first thing that we really wanted to be able to do in dealing with social emotional learning was to ensure that we had a group of student leaders who were prepared, one, to intervene in circumstances or report in circumstances where teachers couldn't necessarily see. In particular, at the secondary level, kids have so much under supervised time where a teacher might not be right there. And with social media and other online type communications, we really needed to be able to give students a framework of understanding and centered it around behaviors in which students can inflict harm on other people, whether intended or not. And then how do we put structures in place to help to be able to mitigate that harm? And so it really transcended any of the focuses that we wanted to put on the school year. We've used our active bystanders as students who not only could help within the school community, but then also to get those students out to receive information from parents and provide information to parents. When we did community nights, we would have our trained active bystanders host events for parents that we did on issues of bullying, harassment, online communication, student safety. Then subsequently went through a process of establishing a faculty reporting network at our school, because someone's not always going to feel comfortable coming forward to their mom or dad. They're definitely not always going to feel comfortable coming forward to a principal, even if we might be engaging, because they're concerned about what the consequences or ramifications might be if they bring something forward. So part of the structures of social emotional learning first focused on training students to assist in the process of mitigating harm-doing behavior and to provide support. Then subsequently creating a network that allowed students to be able to bring things forward to adults in their lives to be able to get it out so that it could get off of their plate. When I first got to school, we also put in place structures for changing our approach to the way that we manage behavior in the school. And I'm a huge proponent of restorative justice for students. And, that takes a lot of education, not just for students, but for teachers to understand that, putting a student out of school for a suspendable offense isn't always the best way to approach things. It has a negative impact on that student by missing that day or multiple days of school. And granted, sometimes it certainly is necessary when there are issues of safety or other concerns. But what we found was that if we could get students who fell into those circumstances on campus more, that they performed better academically. They were more engaged with the school community. They were more likely to engage in pro-social behaviors. In addition to the fact that as we elevated their educational opportunities, we also changed their peer influence. And that part of that peer influence was really important for us in that a student who might be shy might not always come forward, but in a classroom where they're exposed to students who have leadership and they use those students for self-help, that those students who were trained could help counsel them into ways to get that support. This year, I'm very happy at my school to be in the first year of PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, where we've contracted with the University of Massachusetts, Dr. Sarah Whitcomb, and really putting together a social emotional learning curriculum that's going to be deeply embedded in the values that we have shared at the school. And unfortunately, we're in year 0, and we were just about to host meetings with students and with families, and now we'll be in the process of setting those up online so that we can still make that process to help them create those definitions of how students should best be able to conduct themselves as they interact with one another, as they interact with their content, as they interact with their school, as they interact with their community, and also as they interact with things that they might encounter in terms of emotional concerns that previous generations might not have been as skilled at helping them to understand and helping point them to people that they could understand. So it's partially on hold because of the circumstances right now, but we have a really clearly defined 3-year process that is going to be built off of the foundation that we've established over the previous years of building really strong student leadership as a foundation to keep an eye out for one another as a primary objective of our kids.
Thank you. Jen?
Hi. The next question is, how would you ensure that the district is providing support and enrichment to English learners who fail to meet or exceed the learning standards?
Well, I think that from having a conversation with the principals the other day, I was excited by the prospect that and the opportunity that exists in this school community, where the educators have invited families out, and the principals had indicated that they have a strong contingent of students where the family doesn't speak English as a first language showing up to these community events. And so that outreach is incredibly important, because very often people don't have the means or may be reluctant to communicate with the school what needs they might have. And I think that the WIDA test, the WIDA test and the results of the access tests, and being able to ensure that educators are really well skilled at using the can-do descriptors to understand where their students are and where their students need to go as part of next steps are very important, and can really help communities like ours, where we have a large contingent of students and families who don't speak English as a first language, that it's going to take an entire community to be involved. I mean, ultimately, I think as we look into issues of school choice, that there is potentially a unique opportunity that exists in our community that we should consider exploring, which is to become a bilingual school community, and for my child to be able to go to school where they would have the opportunity not only to say learn how to speak Spanish, but would have the opportunity on a day-to-day basis to interact with children and families who are native language speakers. I mean, students have to go to other countries to be able to do that. And that may be an opportunity for us to pull in school choice kids in the area as a result of the fact that we're able to provide better services. And then that compounds itself so that we're in a circumstance where we're putting kids out with a state seal of biliteracy because they're able to speak both English and Spanish, and that the entire school community is involved in that process. And we've not only dedicated the resources, but found a way to get those resources expanded as a result of the fact that we've built the comfort in this community where students can really comfortably learn another language in a way that's consistent with what the way that educational research tells us they should be learning to speak another language, which is immersion. And their peers are here in our district, and we should be taking advantage of that opportunity.
Thank you.
Cassie?
Hi, Brian. Can you briefly describe your experience with special education laws, compliance, and supporting special education programs throughout your district?
Yeah, I've had a pretty significant amount of experience in dealing with issues in special education that really began with my experience at Mohawk Trail when I was the principal there. And I made some decisions that, despite the fact they were made in ignorance of the actual circumstances, there was data there that was shocking to me. So we had a pretty significant number of students who were in an alternative program on our campus at the secondary level. And what I realized very early on was that our regular education teachers, and this is not to impugn their integrity, this has more to do with the system that existed at the time and the steps that I felt like we needed to ensure that our students were actually being educated in the least restrictive environment. So none of these students were even partially mainstreamed. So they were all being taught by special education teachers at the secondary level rather than being supported by special education teachers and being taught by experts in their content. So by virtue of that dynamic, they were being denied the same grade level access to curriculum development and therefore the same vested 14th Amendment property interests in their education by virtue of the fact that they were, and I'm going to use really loaded language here, but they were farmed out. And what I realized really early on was that these students had no shot. They had no shot to compete in the economy. In addition to the fact that the system was set up in a way that I remember going to one team meeting for a student who was not at all involved in the program and seeing that a member of the outside organization that was running this program that we had contracted had been invited in. The concern that I had was we were not at the point where we were making a referral to that particular program, but this person was being invited in to convince other people that they wanted a client. In addition to the fact that we had 228 restraints in that last year that they were there. And it was at that particular point that I realized, like, we have to be the ones who take responsibility for these students and their education. We subsequently took the program over ourselves. The following year, we had 2 restraints. We had, of the 14 kids who were in the program, 9 of them had at least 1 course in the mainstream. And I would have to look back at the data, but I believe that 11 of those 14 students ultimately graduated from Mohawk Trail Regional High School as a result of the work that was done by the educators in that program, working collaboratively with educators out in the building to get those students out in the mainstream. Other aspects of what I've dealt with in special education at the extreme ends really have been related to ensuring that Students who might have severe disabilities are able to attend field trips. So for example, we go to Nature's Classroom, and if we have a student who is on an IEP and they have a one-to-one in their IEP, then we need to financially prepare for that as a school district to ensure that that student gets that same opportunity. And I feel like we've been really consistent in doing that in the time that I've been at Hopkins Academy, because we do take a number of overnight trips as well as other trips out of the school district. And I feel like we've always been able to provide FAPE for those students. We have 2 students, and I spoke about this the other day with some of the principals, one who came up from the elementary school and one who had come from another school district. And they were both students who were one had been entirely in an alternative program, and the parent wanted that student to get an opportunity in the mainstream. We received the student. We saw no reason why we couldn't make that change. The parent was willing to meet with us to amend the IEP, and was flexible enough to allow us to be able to work within the constraints that are provided by the team meeting process to call them in if we felt like we needed to make changes. Ultimately, we had that student from 7th grade. They are now a senior. That student will have completed 4 advanced placement courses, has participated in mock trial, is a member of the cross-country team, and is going to Westfield State College next year. And I'm so proud not only of that student and their family for believing that this kid had the capacity to do it, but I'm really proud of the way, in particular, our regular education educators were really supportive of this student being in their classroom. They were the ones who really made it work, because they made the effort to really understand the kid and develop a meaningful relationship with him. Another student who didn't have the same type of behavioral concerns or issues, but intellectually was off grade level and had been educated off grade level for the last couple of years of elementary school. Our middle school special education teacher did a phenomenal job of working with this student to accelerate them up to speed. As they got closer, once again, it was our regular education teachers who helped this student get up to grade level, pass their MCAS in the 10th grade. And this student is now going to Castleton State College in Vermont, and going to be playing with their soccer team. And this is a student who everybody, when they came in the 6th grade, was saying, oh, he's going to go to the technical school, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. It's not up to us as educators to make those decisions. It's up to us as educators to provide the full breadth of opportunity that every other student has. And as much as special education, to me, has its own realm, it is up to the regular education teachers to develop the skills to ensure that special students on IEPs get the same educational opportunities as every other student in the school. And I believe that's where my focus has been.
Thank you. Heather?
Hi, Brian. I'm Heather. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Heather.
So I'm curious, how do you find the right balance between improvement and innovation? It's particularly a concern because our district has somewhat limited resources.
Yeah, I think it comes down to time. And I think one of the things that I've been fortunate enough to work with people who have understood that any of us, our principals, the school committee, you know, I look at your district plan and you guys are going into, you selected 6 things as a target. And that makes a ton of sense, because almost anything that a school or a district might do, either individually as a building or vertically as an entire district, require collaborative effort. And in order for people to have the time to meaningfully collaborate, instead of just sitting in on a meeting and giving input and then going back to what it is that they're doing from day to day, I think that there are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind. The first thing being that we want to be immediately attentive as we're going through the process of developing strategic plans of any sort, of paring it down to make sure that we're able to thread the needle. Do not inundate your building or your district with initiative fatigue. Teachers' time is best spent with students and families and content. And so we need to keep that off their plate. And I will, from my experience, say the same thing with principals. If I'm not able to spend my time with students and families, then my time is misused. So I think it's really important to get as many administrative tasks as possible, either off the plate of teachers or ensure that we're giving them time that's segregated away from their instructional responsibilities to be able to execute those tasks in a way that's really clearly defined. We also have to be aware of what's coming in through the state. I'm very impressed that Principal Menard managed to secure an Innovation Pathways grant. That's an exceptional opportunity for our school and something very exciting to be walking into, or potentially be walking into. And you know, I'm hopeful that we'll also head out to do early college high school in the very near future to, again, extend opportunities for really rigorous coursework to all of our students in the school district. But I think that any of those things that are undertaken, either one, need to be narrowed in their focus, or two, need to be put together with teams who have targeted themselves, like professional learning communities. In our school district, for example, we went after the Innovation Pathways grant. We also got granted 2 fields, and we're still waiting on early college high school, but it looks good. But those things were developed by teams of teachers that we gave time to do the work, and they appreciated the leadership opportunity because they had input into how that was going to be developed. They had a clear understanding of how that might impact their curriculum. They also had a really, I think, a sense of not only commitment to it, but when they came out on the other side of it, a sense of achievement, and they didn't feel buried. They felt like they were able to get things done without having a negative impact on their learning, or the learning of their students. We always know that things are going to come in from the outside. We never expect them necessarily to be a pandemic, for example, but we always know that things are going to come from the state. Those are things that we're going to have to do. Those are non-negotiables. As far as the other things, I think you guys have done a really nice job of identifying those things from within your community that you need to focus on. And to the extent that we're able to align those community identified needs with our innovation needs, then we have a narrower focus and we're much more likely to thread the needle than trying to do so many things at once.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll be asking the next question, but just a bit of a time reminder for all of us. We are only about halfway through our questions and we have used well over half of our time. So I don't know if we can talk faster, but I think we can all just kind of be a little aware of that. So Brian, I'll ask the next question. What has been your role in budget planning and development?
It's been really diverse. I mean, from, I think probably at Hopkins, because we only have 2 schools, it's been much more straightforward, and actually have had the opportunity to work with outside organizations, Helping Hearts for Hadley Schools, where we run a road race every year. They've given about $40,000 worth of grants just to Hopkins Academy, never mind what they've done with the elementary school. We also have a board of trustees, and so I have these outside of the operating budget areas of community support that we've been able to integrate into what we do. So every November, for example, my faculty and I are able to put in for a variety of mini grants to our board of trustees, and where they're managing this $3 million endowment where they split the interest goes to the interest is split between scholarships that are given to students and also to mini grants. And out of that, over the last 6 years, we've gotten 5 new Chromebook carts for our buildings. They paid for the transportation for the entire graduating classes of incoming 7th and 8th graders to do overnight team building and educational field trips. And so I've had the opportunity to work with a variety of community organizations in this school district. As has been the case in the 2 previous school districts, I had a much better understanding at that time of how to deal with monies that are allotted in places like excess and deficiency accounts, as well as the operating budget, athletic revolving accounts, and things like that in terms of budget planning. But for the most part, the focus on my budget planning has been, I've been able to weave through the curriculum development process. In other words, if you have not completed as a department the curriculum development process where you can clearly attach resource purchases to an updated curriculum, that it's something that's really difficult for us to move forward with. And so that going through the process of curriculum development, revision, and refinement has helped us to be able to target our purchasing needs at the things that we're making changes in, as opposed to just willy-nilly buying or people asking about the things that they need. So that 5-year process of curriculum development has been a great guide for us. At the same time, in looking at issues of staffing, I have a ton of experience in through my 2 previous schools of having to deal with reductions in staffing and trying to find a way to mitigate that impact on students. Fortunately, at the time, we were going through, at both Mohawk Trail and in Athol, going through declining enrollment with declining revenues, and they were at least somewhat aligned, so we never had to deal with class sizes being too large. But it really requires work at the administrative level for all of us as principals to understand and have a really clear understanding of the impact of those potential reductions on the educational product in the following year. So I've had a great deal of collaborative experience in working with principals from other schools to propose budgets where we're all working together and presenting something to the school committee that makes sense educationally, even in times that have been austere.
Thank you. Tommy?
Hi, Brian. Thomasina. I'm also a former employee of the district, so I'd like to know what your experience has been with collective bargaining and communicating with unions. And also, as a quick follow-up, briefly talk about the negotiation process and what you feel is the role of the principals, superintendent, and the school committee.
Well, as a principal, I haven't been involved directly in collective bargaining, and I've created a culture in the 16 years that I've been a high school administrator where I've also never faced a grievance. I've always believed that good labor relations are exceptionally important in the process, especially when you come into times like this. So, you know, to give you an example of some of the things that I've dealt with in terms of negotiation, it's almost always been impact bargaining, where either I have come up with something or the leadership team or teachers have come up with a great idea. So several years ago, we wanted to open up our online gradebook. We also at Mohawk Trail wanted to have teachers post a website. So what we negotiated through impact bargaining was getting some things, if things were going to be on people's plates, making sure that they had the training, that there was a clearly spelled out timeline for its completion on a regular basis, and a process for accountability within that. But at the same time, also making sure that we were giving something in terms of time on the other end. So we refined what was required in terms of submitting planning documents in exchange for being able to see, for example, at Mohawk, what teachers were giving to kids in terms of posting things on their website and homework. What that did was that helped families and didn't necessarily have a negative impact on my ability to see what teachers were doing in terms of their planning. What it did result in me needing to do was get out into the classrooms more to be able to have conversations, because I couldn't necessarily rely exclusively on the documents, but the benefit to students and families was great. So because of my position as a principal, I've almost always been in a position where I've just been creating and working with the Teachers Association or with the unit of paraprofessionals or cafeteria workers, where I've been helping to create model contract language that could then be brought into the bargaining, as opposed to being invited into the bargaining. Obviously, as principals, we don't necessarily have an interest in that process, and we're sort of mid-level players in that process. And so we've always been, in the jobs that I've been, exempted from participation in that, but I've always been encouraged to and have participated a number of times in creating contract language in particular, as it has an impact on potential working conditions for any of the units that we work with.
Thank you. Heather?
What are your plans for coaching or mentoring administrators?
I think that it's very similar to the work that I believe that I've done with a couple of athletic directors, one of whom is now a principal, and I've had the great fortune of having assistant principals with whom I've worked who have been in their first year. All of them are now currently principals or superintendents. And so I feel like I've had a success in terms of a coaching tree. And I felt like I was good before I met Dr. McKenzie. And since then, I now know that I'm not good, I'm skilled. And there's a difference between the two. That what we do is a uniquely human endeavor. And I think that there are really important things to keep in mind. Administrators work very, very hard. They're 24/7 people, and they need to practice self-care. And one of the things that I think it's really important for administrators to learn is the idea of the 24-hour rule. So we get attacked constantly, and it's our job to receive, and I'm using that word as a loaded word purposefully, because that's sort of the nature of the way that any human being might receive criticism, right? So whether it's about your school, a teacher, a policy that you've put in place, a decision that you've made, we have to be able to receive that feedback, and we need to be able to provide a response. So one of the things that I had taught my current athletic director and my previous athletic director, who are the ones who are most inundated with those types of comments on the ground, was to just listen and employ the 24-hour rule. In other words, especially if you feel like you're going to have a visceral response and you're going to become overly defensive, one of the most important things that you can do is sleep on it and let them know really clearly that you're appreciative of the fact that they've given you the input, and that you're going to give them something thoughtful the following day, rather than something that's going to come from an emotional place. That you're providing them, they asked you for what you thought, not how you feel about something. So I think that's probably the most important thing. I think the second most important thing is you help them to understand that it's really important that we talk with people and not about people. Anytime we're in a situation where we have a criticism of somebody with whom we work, anything that we say with regard to that, even if we're looking for self-help or an idea or trying to understand where we come from, might undermine that professional or that person. And so it's really important that principals and other administrators, and that we all use care in the way that we talk about one another, and make sure that we're talking with people first to understand where they're coming from, as opposed to being in a situation where we're seeking to undermine what it is that they're doing because we just don't agree with it. And I think that that's something those are probably the two most important things that I learned. Make sure that people are hearing your thinking and not what you feel, and talk with people and not about them.
Thank you. Tinny wasn't able to be with us this evening, so I will read her question. I know you mentioned working in one of the previous questions on with some Board of Trustees and some other groups, but how do you envision reaching out to and collaborating with town officials, namely the select boards, finance committees, and town administrators in your?
So I've actually had the opportunity to do quite a bit of that. And, you know, when working with, through the years, and people like Mark Singamond, who's the director of, oh, I'm sorry. Did you shut your mic off? So having the opportunity to work with our local law enforcement in Athol, local fire and public safety, when we had issues of safety constantly on a daily basis, it was extremely important for us to have great relationships with those folks. They became an active presence on our campus all the time, and kids began to look at them as resources rather than something that they needed to be fearful of. As a result of that, the culture and the climate changed. We've done the same thing in Hadley. And what that's resulted in particular, the collaboration with our public safety personnel has resulted in us creating two courses that we started this year, Fire Science 1 and Public Safety. That's actually taught by our fire chief and his staff. And we currently have the 14 students enrolled in that class, have 2 students who are going to the academy. So in addition to being able to create collaboration for the purpose of educating our students, we're also able to cultivate resources for them. These are kids who will be prepared as future hires, and 2 of these kids are going out on emergency calls already. So they've already gotten additional hands and feet on the ground using our students as resources. In terms of the select board, finance committee, and groups like that, there has to be a means of being able to regularly communicate information to them. And I think one of the things that they're going to want to see from the superintendent, I know from my work with Joanne Blyer, that she is already supremely competent with the money. And so from my perspective, what the superintendent's job to do is to show them that they're getting a social, emotional, and academic return on their investment, and being able to work with people in the district to be able to identify how we're going to demonstrate that people are getting an improved educational product for what it is that they're investing in the school community. And that's how people like Ms. Blyer have been able to establish credibility with town budgets and work collaboratively with departments, is being able to make sure that we're keeping them informed, that they're keeping us informed. You know, I think about the work that law enforcement did for us in terms of in Hadley, when the president began to seemingly go after immigrants. And one of the things that they did was they sent out a letter in multiple languages on multiple occasions, and left it at the school and other places where non-English speaking families could really have an understanding, and held several meetings and had school officials there with them, had several meetings around making sure that people still felt comfortable calling police, that they were not there to come in to take them out and remove them from the country. And being able to have partnerships like that really allowed families in the community to be more trustful of the school, as a result of the fact that law enforcement and their outreach helped to take a lot of that pressure off of families and help them to feel comfortable in a time where they would otherwise be fearful. So I think it has to do with trust and credibility pretty much at any level. And I think that those are the most recent experiences that I've had that can contribute to that.
Okay, thank you. And again, just a quick reminder, we have about 5 questions in less than 10 minutes. So
Okay.
We're going to see if we can get them all in. Go ahead, Bill.
Brian, can you briefly tell us about an educational success or accomplishment that you led or to which you made a significant contribution? And conversely, briefly, tell us about an effort or project that you led or assisted with that didn't work, and what did you learn from that experience?
So the first one, the success, I think I've highlighted in letters and so forth, and so I won't belabor that. But one of the things that I think was, really encouraging for me was taking the 625 and 632 allocation grant money that was left available in Athol and not necessarily really directed. We had about $14,000 the first year, and we turned that into credit recovery for students who were at risk of failing courses while the courses were en route. And we bargained with the Teachers Association to create a memorandum of understanding that they would be paid a particular rate, and they staffed these sessions, which would typically happen on Saturdays and sometimes after school. That, combined with the fact that we opened up our enrollment into honors and advanced placement courses, not only did we increase our advanced placement enrollment by 258% in that first year, but over the 3 years that I was in Athol, we got the graduation rate from 60% up to 81%. And that's one of the things that I am most proud of. As far as something that I would characterize as being, for lack of a better phrase, a failure. So in my second year, we had student leadership that had created a diversity club, and that diversity club created programming and led programming, and we pulled in trainers, and we got our students to be able to understand how to engage in challenging dialogue about cultural differences. But at the same time, we weren't necessarily seeing an impact on our culture. And when it came to a head in 2 things that I ultimately had to endure and helped us to grow as a school community. One, I had a sit-in that was put together by a number of female students. It was very large. There was a large level of participation. And when it all came to fruition, ultimately, they had a huge impact on recreating and recrafting a policy that helped us to be able to put something in place so that issues of sexism could be addressed in the building. And they pointed out a number of things that we weren't even really able to see. And then the other issue that had arisen, I had spoken about earlier, which was a student having posted something that was, really racially loaded, that divided the school community, ultimately ended up being something that refined that work. But I look at those two things ultimately as necessary failures. Ultimately, if the students had not stepped up in the first case, we would not have been able to make the change that we did, not just to our dress code, but also to the way that we interact with students when we have a concern about their dress, which is privately, we treat them with dignity, and we don't call them out and body shame them in front of their friends. And that change to me came directly from students and was really a result of their effort in what I would consider to be a lack of attention on my part.
Thank you. Cassie?
Brian, what means of communication do you use currently in engaging with the community? What have you found to be the most successful, and what have you tried, and have you tried any that have not been successful?
Yeah, I think that communication through email and doing it through our student information system is very, very easy to use, and we're all pretty facile in it, that we can get a great deal of information out and invite people in a really short period of time. That also allows us to be able to get survey information from large contingents of stakeholders in the school community. But we've also done outreach by, again, putting our trained active bystanders out and having them select a topic where we invited the community in. One of the things that I found was in trying to do that, and I'm reasonably sure that you guys are in your district, that your principals get varying levels of attendance at their community nights, but it can be very difficult to get people to come out. And one of the things that I found is when students are leading the conversation, they're more likely to come out, if for no other reason than they're willing to listen to not only their kid, but somebody else's kid. And I found that secondary students are a great resource in terms of being able to prepare them to be on stage, because they're the ones who are most impacted. They're the future leaders. They're the ones that I feel like the community will also converse with in a way that's a little bit more measured than they might be with us as adults. And we can get folks to interact in a way that's going to be productive. So some of the other things that I've done has been able to invite members of the community in from various aspects of the community. This past year, for example, we conducted our first career day, and all of the people who offered to put time into the career day, with the exception of the keynote speaker, were parents in the school district. And they did everything from people who worked in the medical profession, to public safety, to farmers, to people who worked in research labs and on marketing. And for them to come in and interact with our students and to get positive feedback from them on the way out, I think speaks volumes of the type of climate and culture that exists at Hopkins Academy, that's largely a result of the leadership on the part of students and their willingness to allow the community to come in and have an impact on them.
Thank you. Haley?
Sorry. Can you discuss your perspective on the leadership of a district with declining enrollment?
Yeah, it is the most challenging issue by far that's faced in this school district, also in my current school district and school districts throughout the area. And so I think the biggest thing that we need to focus on is, one, keeping the students that we currently have and getting better educational outcomes. And I think the next thing that we have to focus on is making sure that our school district is excellent, and that people in the district, in the schools, that parents have, that we can rely on their word of mouth to say, my kid's having a great experience there. You know what? This is a pretty good school. You should probably check this out. Because the only way that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves is to ensure that we have a school choice inflow. Every school district that I've been at, I've been able to turn around those numbers. I've been able to have a positive impact on the community, positively promoting its school, positively promoting its students, positively promoting its teachers and the quality of education. And I'm very proud of that work. And it largely has to do with identifying the strengths of the schools, building off of those strengths as a foundation, and stealing ideas from people, whether it's teachers, parents, or students, on how we can make that school an attractive place for other people. How can we get kids to come into this school? And I think that really is at the heart of what we need to do in this day and age, is we have to be able to get more kids. And unfortunately, we're going to have to be able to steal some other people's kids.
Okay, we do have 2 more questions left we'd like to squeeze in. We're technically out of our hour allotment, but we can take a couple of extra minutes if that's okay with everyone. Okay, Cassie, please.
So our district has been and expects to continue to go through change. Can you please discuss your perspective on leadership during periods of change?
I think it's important to have a really clear understanding of the implications of what that change might look like. So for example, I've watched the district from afar, despite the fact that I've been a little bit overwhelmed with the work in my own districts to pay too much attention. I went through something similar at Mohawk, where we talked about the closure of schools and refining resources, and how can we make sure that we're going to do things more efficiently. So I've had a number of opportunities to sit with groups of people and develop contingency plans for what might happen. I think what's really important, and probably the most important role of the superintendent, is to clearly explain to all of the stakeholders in the school community what the opportunities are that exist in that change and what the implications are for that change, what things we might not have anymore as a result of the need to make that change. But hopefully in circumstances where districts are dealing with issues of declining enrollment, that I've always been working with people and will always have the mentality that any of those changes that we need to go through, it's very important that we identify the educational opportunities and potentially the financial opportunities that exist there, and highlight those as the things that we focus on as the foundation for making that change. If people have a really clear understanding of how the change is going to occur and how it's going to impact them, then we can pull a community on board to make sure that everybody's on board with that change and they can help put all of their effort into seeing it through.
Thank you. Tommy, would you like to get your question in? Tommy?
It would help if I unmuted it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's true.
Can you just briefly discuss the most difficult personnel problem you have ever dealt with and how you resolved it?
I think the most difficult personnel problem that I ever dealt with was a circumstance where I had a very, very talented teacher who was a remarkable performer, was very engaging with the kids and very well respected amongst the students. However, they frequently did not come into work on time. Grading was not necessarily done. In some cases, work was not returned to students in a timely manner. And ultimately, when it came down to it, I couldn't even verify that the grades that had been entered, that the assessments were valid. So I started out in explaining all of this stuff individually to the teacher in the presence of a member of the Teachers Association, so that they had an understanding of the things that we needed to focus on. And like any other initiative, narrowing those things down to this teacher needed to do this and this and this in order to be considered to be a proficient teacher. Ultimately, unfortunately, after 2 years of going through that process with the teacher, the same conditions existed. And ultimately, in going through the process of trying to get that teacher to make the improvements, they ultimately ended up resigning. And it was unfortunate that the resolution came about not because we didn't provide the support, because we did. But the resolution came about because the educator was not either willing or able, and I can't say which was which, but they did not in fact make the changes that they needed to make in the best interest of students. And as a result of that, when we got to the point where we had to go through hearing, all of my documentation was aligned, and I was ready to move forward on some disciplinary action, and the teacher didn't want to move forward on that. That was most difficult for me, and the most difficult set of experiences that I dealt with. I've gone through terminations or taken disciplinary action against other employees, but this was by far the most talented educator that I had ever seen. And part of the challenge in moving that teacher on, or them making the decision themselves to move on from that, I think came from the fact that they understood that they were not, they were no longer acting in the best interests of kids. And that ultimately, that resolution came about, I think, because I provided support while simultaneously sending a clear message of what the expectations were and when that person was not meeting them. And never blending those two things together to create a mixed message made it really clear for that person to see. And if they had not seen, while we may have gone through another period of time, it's likely that it would have ended up in termination.
Okay, thank you. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. We appreciate it, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Good luck. And thank you guys very much.
Thank you.